Excellent. Well, it's 9:55 and welcome to the Community Climate Action Conference of the Ross Biosphere. My name is Kevin Frediani. I'm the host for today. I'm the chair of this meeting. Behind me, there is a group of fantastic people who've not only made sure that I've got the right notes in front of me, but also made sure that you guys can all be here to hear, participate, and join in. It's our future, as they say. The what I'd like to do is just thank our support from the National Lottery together with our Planet Fund, and note that parts of the event will be recorded for those that cannot attend today. We encourage the use of Zoom chat for questions and comments throughout the talks, and please do make sure that in between, when others are speaking, you turn off your microphones. As I said, my name is Kevin Frediani. I'm a former resident and operations manager at the National Trust for Scotland in VU. In that role, I was fortunate to be part of the initial working group that helped explore the concept of the Ross Biosphere Reserve. It therefore feels right to begin this morning by taking a moment to witness the support that many of you have given over the succeeding years to create this space and achieve that early ambition. Today, I see an organisation that is helping to explore the interconnections of biodiversity of people, informing and facilitating discussion like today to progress a sustainable place together with its community. The outcome to create a sustainable, inclusive place where people live, work and play in harmony with nature. What more can we ask for? I would also like to thank the organising team, Zoe, Kathleen and Natasha, for inviting me to be the chair today. They may still yet regret that choice, but I know they've been working hard to bring together an inspiring day with many knowledgeable and enthusiastic session speakers. I also note that they've built in an opportunity for you all to engage and share your ideas, experiences, and ask further questions with facilitated themes in working groups that we'll break out into later today. I remind you the day is organised with a key aim to celebrate existing community-led climate action and encourage more people to get involved. At the heart of today's discussion is the climate crisis, the result of unsustainable natural resource use and a human population growth globally that takes from nature at a rate that is beyond the carrying capacity of the available resource, a challenge that has been driven by the supply chains and consumerism that we're all connected to in the increasingly globalized economy, creating a polarized social system that succeeds through corporate exploitation, thrives on neoliberal ideology, and feeds from the basal instincts to look after oneself and one's kin. A weak thread between us all being made transparent as a direct result of Putin's war in Ukraine, where we understand the impact of marginalized rather than empathizing, that see the results of othering rather than embracing, and the problems of accumulating rather than sharing. A challenging place to find ourselves, but one we are increasingly told must be acted out locally to find solutions, as we must learn to think global and act local, to paraphrase Sir Patrick Geddes, the first professor of botany at the forerunner of the University of Dundee, from where I join you today. So it is this first session that seeks to explore the projects and prototypes that people have been exploring in Westeros while working hard towards a rebalancing of the underlying system. Please join me and thank them for sharing today as examples we can help build upon in the future towards a sustainable place together. I'm now going to hand over to Natasha Hutchinson, General Manager of the Ross Biosphere Reserve.
Thanks, Kevin. I'm just going to set up a brief presentation. Many of you might have heard this before in different iterations, but it's useful for those of us who are joining for the first time today. So most of us, or all of us, know that Westeros has a dramatic landscape that to many appears wild, when in fact it has been managed by people as long as memory holds. This is a place of natural beauty, wild mountains, sea and land, remote communities, and geological and biological diversity. And the Westeros Biosphere has a role to play here of driving progress, gaining knowledge, and celebrating this special area. Working at a landscape level, listening to local communities, achieving international recognition, and actively solving problems. The biosphere doesn't draw a hard line between people and nature. Instead, the biosphere is developing mutually beneficial relationships to build thriving societies in harmony with the landscape. UNESCO biospheres are often located in beautiful landscapes, and Westeros is no exception, but they're also often located in places of challenge. And again, this is not an exception in Westeros. Biosphere status isn't just about our environment. It's a world recognition that our communities are actively working toward a more sustainable future, trying to find that balance between development and conservation to ensure the well-being of our people and place for generations to come. In addition to the accolade, the Westeros Biosphere is also an organization which focuses on a range of work for social, economic, and environmental benefit. Specific projects are shaped through the board, who are elected by our membership. By sharing good practices, we can identify and promote partner activities and share case studies of management in order to be an example to others. The biosphere has no statutory authority, but what we can do is act as a conduit in linking opportunities for collaboration with and between stakeholders. We're here not to compete with the activities of other local organizations, but to complement and add value to them. We work together with communities and public bodies to address challenges to become a more sustainable region, but sustainability has almost become an overused term in recent years. Now more than ever, it is an important concept and goal, and perhaps we need to change not the goal, but the way we think about it. It's not a to-do list, it's a way of living. The wedding cake model of sustainability seen here on the left was developed to challenge the traditional thinking that social, economic, and ecological development should be regarded as separate blocks. It instead implies that economies and societies are embedded parts of the biosphere, where the economy serves society so that it evolves within the safe operating space of the planet. And then the biosphere can also be considered as an approach to placemaking, which indicates a specific way of thinking about and making decisions for Westeros as a place based on the knowledge and priorities of its local communities. Whether it's promoting the preservation of wildlife and habitats, or supporting a better understanding of nature and global issues, to fostering a sustainable economy and society. Having a strong sense of place will help us unveil the special qualities of this area and how to use them to inspire a positive, sustainable future. By leveraging the powerful UNESCO brand and collaborating with the global network, Scotland's UNESCO sites can access new program, partnership, and funding opportunities and influence key decision makers. Our UNESCO biosphere here in Westeros is unique because it is entirely community-led, meaning we all have a voice in defining what sustainability is in Westeros. If you're not already a member, please consider joining us for free on our website. Learning isn't just about finding new approaches, it's about building on what we already know. Many problems don't require the reinvention of the wheel. It may simply need a fresh approach based on established best practice. And I'm looking forward to seeing that in action today.
Thank you, Natasha. That was a lovely introduction and overview. And again, the powerful reason for supporting the work that's going on. Okay, the first session is about climate change and the DGS. The Westeros Biosphere has a trail of sustainable development goal posts throughout the region. One of those posts is number 13 for climate action. I'm going to pass over now to Ewan Bush, who's the Community Energy Officer for Garve and District Development Company. He will speak about that, the work that has been going on associated with that post, and who will introduce himself. Ewan, thank you.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm just going to share so I've got a few slides here just to give me to talk about and basically look at what we've been doing in Garve District. So I work for the Garve District Development Company. It's a community organization, and we're looking at what we've done really to support Climate Action 13 and the Sustainable Development Goal that was established in Nations as part of this talk here. So yeah, the region Garve District is community council area. We've got a picture of Achnasheen, so it's from Achnasheen over to Bush Hotel, and Garve, obviously, that's the main area. So it's a wide geographical area, sparsely populated, as most of you know. There's some main routes through to the west, to Ullapool and to Achnasheen, Kyle Gaelach again. So it's a substantial area to cover. So much of what we do in Garvan district, so I'm just going to close a window here to get to see the screen. Much of what we do in Garvan district is raising awareness and supporting initiatives that benefit the environment and local community. And it can be seen to be rooted in the SDG goal climate 13 action, 30 climate action. My work is funded by the Scottish Government Investing in Communities Fund and covers the three following areas, themes: home energy, community transport, and community. And the projects are centered around these themes to reduce CO2 emissions and our resilience on fossil fuels, and to build a more resilient future for the Garvan district community are actively being explored. Sorry, here we go. I've just got a map here to illustrate the area that I was describing before, the community council, Garvan district community council area. Obviously, Garve to the right of your screen, Achnasheen and Ullapool. Home energy, that's been working with the Garvan district households to improve home energy efficiency, reduce energy bills and CO2 emissions. That's the broad goals there. But from daily work I work quite closely with Home Energy Scotland and to encourage the uptake of freehold surveys, identify areas for improvement in energy efficiency, and look at what grants or zero interest government loans might be available. And I would work to support the households to access those loans and identify accredited installers. If they're going to go ahead with it, they basically installers. So and work continues to investigate funding avenues to establish a Garvan district home energy efficiency grant, top up existing government funding streams. Community energy, another main theme there. So energy produced from solar PV and hydro may be used for heating and power or other community-owned facility, benefiting both the community and environment. We've explored the potential for a community hydro stream on the Blackwater River, runs through Garve at Silver Bridge. Although the site has potential, it was not currently economically viable due to the lack of feed-in tariffs, which is a large incentive that was removed back in 2016, the beginning of it anyway. So basically, you get very minimal payments now for producing power from community energy. So it really has to be a viable project to stack up financially. And unfortunately, that we couldn't make that case. It's been identified as having potential for ground-mounted solar arrays. And combined with battery storage, this could enable rapid EV charging not otherwise available due to local grid restraints. So that's something it's quite a big barrier at the moment. The local grid is unable to take significant, energy for large-scale projects and transmission where the big urban centres are. So we have quite a lot of issues with the local grids throughout Scotland, especially in the Highlands, that they're unable to. They don't have the capacity really to make this switch to electric and to allow households to use air source heat pumps or rapid chargers for charging vehicles, etc. So a lot of work to do there. And the energy officer, that's myself, working with local and possible future schemes may be used to benefit the local community and environment. Here's a slide of the Blackwater River where the hydro scheme was proposed. It's a beautiful spot there. And community transport, that's the other at the moment, actually. So in 2021, the Garve District Development Company engaged with stakeholders and wider community to produce a sustaining choices Garve District Action Plan for the active travel and sustainable transport. And a document was produced, the action plan. There's a little quote here from it. The Sustaining Choice worked with communities across Scotland to develop a body of evidence that demonstrates the changes they would like to see in their area regarding walking, wheeling, cycling, and public transport. This is particularly timely given the challenge of climate change and net zero targets, the need to reimagine the environments we live in as a result of the COVID pandemic, and the need to implement a green recovery as a consequence of both. So one of the projects set up quite early on when I started, I've been working in my third year. So obviously we were working through the pandemic. There were a lot of challenges there just to reach people. Obviously platforms like what we're using at the moment was very useful for a lot of the meeting. So one of the early projects was On Your Bike group, which was set up as an early priority to look into developing safe cycle routes in the area and to encourage travel. So that work is ongoing at the moment. Also establishing a rapid EV charging network at key locations in Garve District is essential to enable the switch to future electric transportation. Developing EV charging facilities, including associated amenities and rest places for visitors, can benefit the environment, reduce CO2 and other harmful emissions, whilst providing income and employment opportunities to the area. And we're now looking into investing in electric vehicle that will be available to respond to various local transport needs, and working with stakeholders to identify suitable sites for locating the rapid EV chargers at strategic location priority. Here's a wee example of a solar canopy. I think if we'd be looking at anything, obviously this is something that will provide power in the summer, but not during the winter months. But it's interesting to note that we have a lot of tourism and visitors to the area, and there's a huge fluctuation in the load. So in the summer, the energy could be produced by one of these solar arrays, or a larger ground-mounted one, I would probably say was more worthwhile, which could then be used to charge during the summer months at least. And then in the winter months, you have a lot less demand, so you'd be looking at using the grid power more. But these systems are available that can swap between the two, and definitely worth looking into. Achnasheen is one of the main potential sites for a charger because of the location. It's a crossroads between two main roads. There's currently one there actually that the Highland Council have been struggling with to get it connected, but I think it's maybe being connected in coming weeks, or maybe up and running already. But I think there's plenty of room for more chargers, and as I said, the rapid charging I think is the key, because you really need to be able to move on to your destination. You maybe want, if you can get a good boost in half an hour, that's quite feasible for a lot of people. And also the range anxiety, you don't want to go out in the middle of the hills with a flat battery. So having these chargers at key locations especially on the West Coast 500 makes total sense. So I'm working to see what we can do, and working with stakeholders and see if we can start off, especially the idea of being for this taxi, that it would be able to stop and charge and sit at possibly Achnasheen seems like a good point for it, and then continue on its journey. So it would be the sort of it could be this starting point and the end point of the day for the vehicle to charge up overnight as well. Also in the west on the Ullapool route, we've got the Old Guish Hotel, which there's some interesting new wind farm developments there that, you know, whatever we feel about wind farms, it's likely that the one will go ahead there, called Kirkin, in the next 4 years. So I'm actively talking to them to see what benefit we could receive locally from it. Traditionally, those benefits would be form of payments made out to the community. And a lot of the funding for projects that we do in Garve district comes from the local wind farm funds. But it'd be interesting to see how they could maybe support vehicle charging and rapid charging in the area as well. Here's some examples from other community activities. Various groups have been set up, growing groups, litter collection, where they're doing an amazing job, just picking up the stuff in the lay-bys that's dropped off throughout the area. We have knitting classes in the village hall. Obviously, during the pandemic, the village hall was out of bounds, but it's great to see it's now back to life and lots of different activities there, cycling, maintenance, art classes, etc. So thank you very much. I come to the end of my slides. If anyone's wanting to ask any questions or do that.
Thank you for that, Ewan. I think the suggestion is that those I go through the questions that are actually in the chat to begin with, and one of them you've already answered. That was Isabella was asking about the wind farm in the Garve district and whether the community was involved in that or got benefits. I think you've answered that. But she also
it depends
asked
which. Yeah, sorry, it was.
Oh, sorry. If there's more than one, could you share any information you've got about the wind farms in the district and whether the community are involved in them or they get any benefits?
We do that, yes. So the community organization is called LCT, Lochaber Community, and they receive all the benefits from the schemes that were set up as far back. It's before my time now, but I think it's back to 2016 or further when the first wind farms came in. So there's about 3 different schemes in the area, and there's also a hydro scheme, I think, some benefits coming from that. So they're all funneled into the community trust there. And then the Garve District Development Company was set up to try to access some of those funding and, you know, look at what projects could be hit the community. So it's all about benefiting the community and environment.
Thank you for that. Ewan, you're sometimes dropping in and out, so you might need to turn off your camera just so that we can actually hear you.
Okay.
It seems to be okay at the moment. Isabella goes on to ask a question about the train companies and whether you're thinking of working with them to increase frequency of train or ask them to take more bikes on the train.
That's an interesting point. I suppose the frequency side of things, yes, it could be definitely that would be a good thing. Them actually very difficult to get in touch with to even discuss anything, because we thought ideally we should get a charger in Garve somewhere around the station. That would make total sense, but so far it's been quite challenging. I think especially during the pandemic, trying to get through to the relevant people in organizations hasn't been the easiest, but I'll take that on board, definitely. One exciting thing that's very early stages is the Kyle route has been identified by the Scottish government as potential for converting to hydrogen. There's a hydrogen project at the moment by they're actually designing or refurbishing a train to convert it to hydrogen. So I'm in very early discussions with that group to see if there's any mileage of producing hydrogen in Garve and from wind turbines that could be used then to power a very a green train, basically hydrogen train.
That's an incredible innovation if you can carry that off.
I'll see if I can get that one to carry it off. And we may be talking 4 or 5, 6 actually happening. I think the first stage of the route is from Inverness to Wick, and that's going ahead relatively soon. So
along those sort of themes, there's also a question around exploring the potential for solar and hydro, and you did again mention those, but there's a specific question around, do you work with consultants to explore those?
Well, yes, those consultants, say we went to Community Energy Scotland, they've been consulted in the past. So there is assistance with that if we were to take a community project forward. Are you hearing me okay?
Yes, no, you're coming across great.
So so that would, if we were to engage consultants, it would probably be through that route.
And in terms of just drawing out some of your experience, Nick asks around a question around seeking funding for those great projects. How much of your role is spent completing funding applications?
Not time to date, because I've been trying to filter out what projects are viable and just move ahead with them and get to a point where we've got something we feel is really worthwhile pursuing, because it's very easy to go down funding applications for feasibility studies, etc., where a lot of that work I can probably do the initial feasibility work myself and get it to a point where it's, you know, not just another study that doesn't go anywhere. Of course, we need to look into these things, but I think my role is to maybe identify the ones that are most viable at an early stage.
That's a great skill to have in terms of sifting out where you direct your time. Maybe I'll come and speak to you afterwards about how to do that better. But in terms of just looking back through the questions, that Fiona asks about some of the mechanisms around the surplus funds that are generated within these projects, and asks whether other communities in the biosphere could benefit from them, access and benefit, that maybe don't have a wind farm in their own locale.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think the criteria set out in accessing those funds, that it has to be directed solely at Garve district if that's where the wind farm's located. So, you know, I have to see the picture, but it's hard to think we could collaborate, but you would have to sort of have match funding from other areas. But I'm definitely feel like on especially transport, you know, a wee community vehicle that's just operating tightly with that region with no ability to go out with the region, that doesn't make much sense. So if we can argue the case that it's benefiting as a result of, you know, collaborating with your neighboring community, it would make total sense to me. But we'll have to wait and see how that goes. So yeah, because we're not just an I. I can see where the question is coming from. It makes total sense to me, but
yeah, but not yet. So thank you, Ian, on that one. I'll Ingo, again, please, the audience, if you can type in some messages of some questions for Ewan. Messages if you like as well, but I think questions probably more relevant right now. I've got a couple of myself actually. Just listening to your talk, I was thinking, what are the barriers to the uptake of the offer in your local area? You mentioned feed-in tariffs, which is obviously a big incentive economically, and you said also that the capacity for the grid to support the sort of localized development and uptake of this is also falling short at the moment. But what other barriers have you found that we could maybe explore? Somebody in this group might better help later on. You never know.
Well, on the home energy front, big barriers there. Simply identifying the level of investment required to actually insulate homes in the area to a standard that one needs to achieve to fit a air source heat pump, for example. Because these air source heat pumps are great things, but they become inefficient if they have to work too hard and there's a home that hasn't been insulated to a high standard. Then they're not really viable because the client or the homeowner would end up with a very large electricity bill. So key is insulating properties, and how to do that with older buildings isn't straightforward because there's various sort of technical issues just to do with the fabric of the building. Maybe the roof needs attention, the walls might need reharling, there maybe is a drainage issue, older properties. So it's called retrofit, that side of things. I think the level of funding we've got available from government is insufficient to deal with those sort of issues. So the result is don't move forward with applying for a loan. They may not even have maybe on a low salary and couldn't afford to pay back a loan in any case. So as a result, there's very little movement. People are stuck in a situation where they can't afford to do up their homes and insulate them, and they've got high energy bills, and they're basically in fuel poverty.
That's really insightful, Ewan, and something I've also experienced in the part of the world I am now. I think the technology is there, the actual barrier
It's
is
all
around.
over. Yeah.
Yeah. So in terms of looking at that area,
Yeah.
is there an opportunity to release some of those community funds to support people looking for the best ways to retrofit their homes and even establish local circular economies? I'm thinking about the excess sheet wool that could be a really good insulation material, but it might lack a local conversion from sheep wool into something that can be usable in the fabric of the buildings.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, though. I think the barriers or it's very complicated because one house might be suited to one product to insulate, one might be suited to another. So there needs to be a high level of being able to identify the right way forward. And there's a whole new set of government recommendations coming in about how this should be done. But as usual, the more you surveying and etc. you have to do on a property, the more bureaucratic the whole. We end up in a system. Again, nothing progresses. So in a way, it would be nice to look at how it could all be freed up, but it's difficult with the funding route, because then when you hand out money to people, you have to be accountable. So the government's always very cautious.
There's a question about the carrying the grid capacity constraints that you mentioned, and just is there any resources online that people could follow that up and look at themselves to understand where those limits are?
I think there's on SSE website you can find that. I'm sorry, I haven't got the link directly to
it. That's helpful. We can direct people towards that. We might even be able to find that ourselves. But in terms of just picking up on other questions.
Just a quick one on the home energy.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I was just a quick one on the releasing funds from wind farm funds for insulating homes, etc. That's something I've put a lot of work into, and unfortunately we have come into a bit of an impasse there because of the charitable laws and how the wind farm funds were set up in the first the wind farms. We have to follow certain charitable rules and how we distribute money. So if you wanted to put money into an individual household, that would breach the charitable rules at the moment. Yeah, that's why we're looking at other avenues and potentially setting up a new scheme in the future that would be direct specifically to home energy and insulating properties, a very specific thing.
Thank you for sharing that, Ewan. There's a question come through now about a specific project, the Silver Bridge Hydro Scheme. Someone's asking, obviously it's a very beautiful area, and
Hmm.
a much loved woodland walk. And how is the I guess it's the environmental impact assessment undertaken there to make sure that beautification isn't undermined by something that's going in for economic and social benefit?
Exactly, and it's obvious that that's probably one of the main concerns for many people. I mean, all I can say is you can build schemes that they're always going to can be seen as balancing the benefits versus the obvious that it's going to be potentially seen as an eyesore in mines, or the construction process could damage wildlife. I think that can be mitigated.
Ewan, you're just breaking up there, I'm afraid.
You see something as a thing of beauty, as an eyesore.
Okay, sorry about that, folks. I'll alert Ewan when that echo stops.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah. No, Ewan, you'll have to repeat that answer, I'm afraid, because we didn't get any of that.
Still breaking up? Is it any better?
That's better.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Is that any better?
That's better.
Okay, I just moved my phone to stick it out the window. It's got a bit better reception. Sorry about that. Can you ask that question again?
Yeah, so it was specifically about the Silver Bridge hydro scheme and how it will impact upon the beauty of that woodland walk, which is very popular. How do you mitigate against that?
Well, I think to start off with, it's probably unlikely that that scheme will go ahead, simply because of the economics. And I would also say that it is a place of beauty, and many people would object to seeing something put in there. I suppose you would have to demonstrate, if you were going to go ahead with it, that it would sit in its environment, that the area was enhanced in some way by the inclusion of that. But beauty is in the eye of the beholder, so inevitably some people will see an energy scheme as a beautiful thing because it's producing power that we need in a sustainable way, but versus the impact, visual impact to the location that it's being installed in. So it's probably a never-ending discussion or argument, that one, isn't it?
Yeah, no, I think, you know, in terms of balancing those sides, that economic, social, and environmental aspect is you've answered that very well. And obviously, it won't please everyone, but those decisions will be made, I guess, within a transparent way where possible. Nick Tatchell asked a question around the sustaining choices work that you were engaged in, and asked if you could give more details and some points of the benefits and outputs from the project. I just picked up on the active travel. It was really interesting that community lifted that active travel aspect as something they wanted to take forward. But were there other elements that you could elaborate upon?
I think the benefit of doing something like that is really getting people talking and having an body that's managing that process, and enabling different groups in small communities to come together, discuss something in an environment that's sort of neutral and allows different voices to be heard. Because, you know, quite often there are a lot of groups and seem to be what on the face of it should be working together projects, but in reality there can be other political issues going on in the background that get in the way of progress. So it's a great thing to take part in.
Thank you. There was a comment about a comment that if Scottish government wants to install air source or similar in so many homes, they'll need to double in the installation rates every year until then. So obviously that's going to require quite a lot of funding streams to come in the next few years if they're going to achieve their own objectives. Do you know if there's anything being moved on that we might look forward to in this region?
Apart from the sort of political statements and ambitions, which are great, we haven't seen any new developments in the funding side of things. Nothing I've heard of to date. So it is a concern that, for example, RHI, which was a national scheme to support renewable heating systems, that's been removed, and there's nothing in its place now to replace it. So we have to wait and see what the outcome may be there.
Okay. Are there any other questions that are coming through that people would like to ask? Ewan, you've covered an awful lot of ground for us today. We can sort of move to a slightly longer break, but just before we do, I wanted to just say thank you very much for not only sharing your role and the great work that you've been doing there, but also the enthusiasm for that, and that you're taking forward in a very measured way. I mean, the fact that you can hang on and answer all of those questions to me with one arm out of the window just makes me smile here in my little seat down south. But in terms of, I think for the others that have been here today, I think you've given confidence that you're somebody that could be approached and engaged with, and will help them realize their ambition, or direct them to someone who might be able to help at some point in the future. So I think on that side, can I just thank you very much for that? I've got one more question coming, actually. Isabel, who was first off the button just before we go, and she's going to be the last one now before we go for that break, is how do you think cycling can be improved in your area, considering that most roads are busy in summer with the NC 500?
Yes, very difficult, really, because some of the roads around Garve are actually narrow and windy and dangerous for cyclists, I would say. So that was identified, very early on. So one of the projects we're looking at the moment is there's an old road at the back of the loch there that runs from Contin through to Garve, and it's an old forestry track. So we're looking at see if we can get some funding to do it up a bit, and that would enable cyclists to take an alternative route. So alternative routes are great if we can identify them and find the funding to do the work, to do them up. Other than that, yes, I suppose more signage would be good. Maybe speed cameras. There's a lot of local support for trying to look at traffic calming measures through the villages there. It would also be helpful for cyclists. Obviously, there's new government legislation about driving and cyclists, and how much you need to give them, because the shift is now very much more on the law side is in favor of cycling, but in practice, how that should be interpreted on a narrow road with poor visibility either side and trees, that might be a different matter. So, but yeah, that's a big question, really, how you get cycles on the road. Also, the distances to cover are far greater than in a urban environment. There will be a few enthusiasts that will want to cycle to work, but for the majority of people, I think using a vehicle is probably still the most likely way forward for travel to work. So maybe it's a more erect type activity that we're going to be looking at, which is beneficial for health as well, and lots of other good things from cycling. But yeah, not an easy problem to solve, the routes, I would say, but definitely more can be done.
Well, thank you very much for the time you shared with us, and and the information that you've given. Yeah, I can already see that people are warming to you, and Eileen Grant has said that maybe sometime you can come down and speak at Lochaber sometime soon. So there's an invitation for you. And in the interim, I'd like to just thank you on a personal level for hanging in there. And it's now time for a quick break. If we'd like to reconvene at 11:05, you could just turn off your cameras, the session's still there. And just remember that if you've got your speakers on, we'll be able to hear you drinking your tea. So it might be useful to turn those off too. But I'll look forward to welcoming you back at 11:05. In the interim, please join me in giving Ewan a great wave and say thank you very much for all you've done.
Thank you, everyone.
So welcome back. As we start the panel discussion on crofting and food growing for climate, I wanted to just reflect on some of the things that we know about the West of Ross Biosphere in its palimpsest landscape, with layers of cultural and living heritage that have been formed over time to the backdrop of deep geology. Together, these elements have helped inform the place we know and love today, a land that has been transformed by the actions and reactions of people and the environment they have interacted with over millennia, where mistakes have been made, where subsistence farming in the landscape was displaced by industrial scale intensified land use, as the environmental limits of productivity were tested and resulted in the subsequent loss of land cover, facilitated by overgrazing and the subsequent erosion. In more recent times, economic development has seen an unhealthy reliance on destination tourism, appealing to the human desire to travel and explore perceptions of wilderness, while putting intense pressure on the infrastructure that barely serves a region's population. Is this the limits to growth that are revealed in an increasingly interconnected community, a binding thread through the existential global threat of the climate crisis that connects everyone here to all the others that reside someplace else? This is a nexus that comes to the fore in this next session, crofting and food growing for climate. We can see globally some of the challenges of this interconnected, globalized world, but also we should be able to see the benefits of local short supply chains. So in terms of explaining how this panel format's going to work, it's an informal dialogue rather than presentations per se, although Joe has stepped in because we've got a slight change to the program. Phil Knott is unable to join us today, but he has made a video that will be put up on the site later. Joe, however, has got a short piece that he'd like to present to you today before he then introduces his session. At the same time, Stephen will then come through later, and he's agreed to extend his talk later on. So if you can post your comments or questions in the chat, we can draw out these in the second half of the panel discussion. But for now, what I'd like to do is hand over to Joe Allen and say, would you introduce yourselves? But before you begin talking, I'll get then Stephen to introduce himself. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. I haven't prepared a presentation because I thought it was just a discussion on the panel, but I'll tell you a little bit about myself. My name is Stephen McDonach. I'm a crofter from Ardnamurchan in Lochaber, and I have worked to build up a group called Food Lochaber, which is a local food group in the region. And yeah, I look forward to speaking with you later. I'll pass over to Joss.
Hi there. Yeah, so my name's Joss Allen, and I'm currently the co-director at Atlas Arts, an arts organisation based on Skye, but we work across Skye, Lochaber and Rassay, and I'm just here for 12 months. But prior to that, I worked with Devon Projects, an arts organisation based in Aberdeenshire, so not the Northwest, where I was part of a 3-year food growing project. Sort of community food growing project of sorts, as well as growing food. Part of the project was really about trying to investigate the sort of entanglement between sort of human lives and more than human lives. And by that I mean the kind of natural world and how food growing can be a really interesting place to explore those relationships, particularly thinking about the kind of climate and ecological emergency. And I wanted to kind of do an introduction through a story. For me, story and storytelling are really important in how I make sense of the world and how meaning is shared and how we produce knowledge. And after finishing this project, I wrote a very short story as a way to try and capture some of the thinking that happened and think about the particular place and the things that could have happened if the project had continued, and some of the things that did happen. So if that's okay, I might share that story by way of kind of maybe opening up a space, and maybe it raises some interesting questions. And I'll just preface that by saying I'm in a privileged position where I can think and talk about food growing. I'm not reliant on food growing as a source of income. I have in the past been in that position, but I currently am. I'm not a crofter either, but I'm very keen in growing food, and have spent a lot of time with people who are food growers and who are dependent on that as an income. So I'll start with this story, if that's okay. So we're going to visit a town, a small town in Scotland. The town is located in the past, present, future world of our collective imagination. As we journey there, some things about this place you may find familiar. Some you may not. For many years, this town was a market town, a place of exchange. People came here from many miles around to sell their goods, to buy the things they needed, to share news, knowledge, and gossip, to celebrate, to play music, drink, and dance. The town supported 100 different shops of all different sizes, selling fruit, vegetables, potatoes, meat, socks, shoes, and sweets. The surrounding area was populated by many farms. Many people's livelihoods depended on working the land. Many people's lives formed in relation to agriculture. Farmers rented their fields from wealthy landlords for all but one day of the year. One day of the year they were landless. Over the years, the farms have increased in size, yet fewer people work the land. Horse-pulled plough has become petrol-fueled tractor. One day, on the outskirts of this town, arrived a large shop, larger than any shop there had been before. Let's call it a supermarket. Shelves piled high with all sorts of vegetables, fruits from abroad, variety like the townsfolk had never known, all in one place. Convenience, choice, affordability. The supermarket was a welcome employment opportunity for the townsfolk too, even though the wages they paid were low. Slowly, however, other shops in the town began to close, unable to compete against the enormous economies of scale made possible by supermarket supply systems. Producers and farmers less connected to the communities they support. Consumers distanced from the food they eat. This is the town we find ourselves in. We arrive in the old town square. It's quiet, not many people are around. We see only one person. They are slowly making their way around the square, spraying the pavement with a liquid held in their backpack. Many buildings around the square seem to be shut or boarded up. But across the road, we see a building full of people. A board propped up against the building's wall reads, Pay What You Can cafe. Low waste, locally sourced, nutritious and tasty food. Come on in and eat together. Together, we are building a national food service. We decide to have a closer look. We are welcomed into the building and sat down at the end of a long table where many people sit. It's hard to tell who's running the cafe and who is here to eat. We strike up a conversation with the person sat next to us. We ask, has this place been open long? They answer, only a few months, but look how busy it is already. What was here before, we ask? Oh, it was a small department store once, but it had been closed for many years, they answer. Now people can come and eat and cook and eat together. Is it a charity, we ask? No, we're a grassroots organisation, they say. It's a social eating space where people can come together to eat affordable, healthy food. It's about building new social relations, mutual aid, not charity. Are there other places like this in town, we ask? Not exactly like this, but across the street is the community kitchen. They've been open for a year and we work with them too. What's the community kitchen, we ask? It was started by a cooperative of local farms and businesses. It's a kitchen that can be used by any local business or community group. It has a catering kitchen, a fruit press, and a pasteurising room, a dairy and meat cutting room, as well as equipment for outdoor catering. The idea is to transform waste produce from farms and supermarkets into food for the community. Some people are making jams and chutneys from food waste from the supermarket. Others are pressing leftover apples from the community orchard into juice and cider. The apple pulp is taken by some of the farmers to feed their animals. It's building a circular economy around food. Isn't it all massive industrial farms around here, we ask? Yeah, there are a lot of them, but things are changing, they say. Just outside the town, there are 2 farmers who run a market garden. They provide 40 people with a weekly vegetable box for 6 months of the year. You pay upfront for it, so the farmers know exactly how much produce to grow. It's less of a risk for them. They call it community-supported agriculture. Isn't that really expensive? Who can afford to pay for all that upfront, we ask? Well, I guess it can seem expensive compared to supermarkets, they say. There's also an organic farm close by too. They deliver vegetable boxes as well, but they have a 2-tiered payment system. It encourages those who can afford to pay a little extra to do so that those who need to pay less can still access fresh vegetables. Currently, they have 50 members, 20 on the higher solidarity price and 30 on the lower price. Where do you get the produce for this cafe, we ask? We try and source as much of it as locally as possible, they say. Some from local organic farms. There are farmers growing all sorts of crops around here organically. We also get produce from the local allotments, where people often have gluts of vegetables they can't eat themselves. So they either donate it to us or we buy it from them. Round the corner, a new bakery has just opened. We get bread from them, anything that hasn't sold that day. They are trying to bake with locally grown wheat, and we aim to source 80% locally, direct from the producers. Would you like anything to eat? The person asks. What would you recommend? We reply. So that's the end of the story.
Thank you, Joss. Really powerful statements coming through there, but also a really wonderful narrative to follow. Reminds me of the Cheviots, the stag, and the black oil. Maybe there's a new opportunity for you to grow that into something of a musical and then go touring as well. Stephen, I wondered if you could just introduce your project just by way as a follow-up. And at the same time, what I'll do is just direct you. Zoe's going to post Phil's organization's biog, so you can see, for those of you who want to follow up on his video afterwards, you can see where he's coming from in terms of the cooperative that they've helped form. But Stephen, over to you. The floor is yours.
Again, that was really interesting hearing the story from Joss there. Just in your introduction, Kevin, you were talking about the move to intensified agriculture. The story in Lochaber is quite different. If you look at the agricultural census data over the last 100 years, agricultural output has dropped by over 90%. 90%. So there's an incredible collapse in agricultural production, despite mechanization and modern methods. And as a result of that, whilst working for Lochaber Environmental Group in 2018, really 2017, I began this idea, but outside of work, I began to kind of map the food landscape. Who were the players? Who was actively involved? What was the capacity to grow the food landscape in the region? Now, Lochaber is quite a vast area. It spans from in the west, Sonnaching in the west, out towards a lighthouse, if you know that area of the world, way out to Invergary in the east, from Glencoe in the south, right up to Mallaig, the Small Isles. So an incredibly large and fragmented group of communities, very like Wester Ross, I imagine. So the challenges of the logistics involved were pretty special. And so I set about trying to work out how that was done, how it was done elsewhere, what lessons could be learned, what sort of historical interventions had been made. People get long in the tooth, especially in the crofting community. They've seen it all before they've heard it. They've encountered initiatives many times and seen fresh-faced people from elsewhere tell them this is a brand new idea. And so therefore, I was very keen not to take that approach. And I spent a lot of time talking to people. I'm a crofter myself, and so I know a lot of folk. And so I set about making an aggregated offering where we could consistently produce, where we could give a year-round offering. And we've grown to around 27 producer members. We sell all year round. The project, the funded project that we eventually got funding for it, and I moved from doing it in my own time to doing work, and that came to an end at the end of the financial year, just in March there. So the group is looking really strong, and have taken on the ownership of it themselves. It's rather than being a cooperative, it's a collective, and they make the decisions. And so they're going from strength to strength. My area really is my area of interest. Is I've worked in with social enterprises in the past, and tried to incorporate those kind of community values of crofting within those enterprises, but taking creative approaches. And I think I've moved from that into looking at the intersection between DMOs, sustainability, and local food. And I've travelled to periphery regions across Europe, from Iceland to Ireland, and I've done some research there, and I've kind of come to the end of that research, and I'm currently doing consultancy work for food from farming. And yeah, a really interesting journey. It couldn't be more appropriate at the moment with the climate and ecological emergency. And I suppose Indigenous agriculture is always touted by the FAO and others as being of paramount concern. Maybe that's often rhetoric, but certainly we have our own version of Indigenous agriculture, and I think it's worth shouting about. Thanks very much.
Stephen, that's absolutely wonderful. What a great start in terms of not only the narrative, this I'm a great advocate of utopian thinking, because I believe you need to reach for the moon just to see how far you can get. The lady called Ruth Levitas at Bristol University inspired me a long time ago to dream big and then achieve what you can. And Stephen, your example is absolutely exemplary. If you think about those social enterprise values, which I share in terms of my own journey, but that focus on that nexus that I was trying to pinpoint, which you've exemplified through your DMO, local food and sustainable short supply chains. A wonderful, wonderful sharing. What I'd like to do as I invite people to ask questions now to help this panel discussion go is I'm just going to sort of light the warm embers underneath our fire as we warm ourselves up and ask how crofting and food growing deliver for communities and climate. And you can answer that in the present. Stephen, you might also reflect in the past, the lessons you learned and brought that forward to the future and what you can share. But if I start, first of all, with Joss, and then I'll go to Stephen on that one.
Could you repeat the question again, Kevin? Sorry.
Yes. So
my connection's
how
up from
can crofting and food growing deliver for communities and climate?
Yeah, that's a really tough question to answer. And maybe I can just, by way of trying to answer that, maybe I can talk a little bit about my experience of running this project in Huntly. And I think some of the questions that we were really trying to wrestle with in that project was around kind of community food growing and maybe some of the kind of narratives around that, and how sometimes, so the project that I was involved in running was supported by the Climate Challenge Fund. I don't know if people are aware of that fund, but a fund that was set up to kind of support people to reduce their carbon emissions in relation to certain things like food growing, waste, that kind of stuff. And so one of the problems that we had in the way that it was funded and the kind of narrative of this funder was that there was a kind of story being told that was for us to, as a community, to deal with climate change, more people in the community had to start growing their own food. And the way that this project was sort of measured in terms of success was really around the reduction of carbon emissions. And so that was the kind of only measure of sustainability that they had, was kind of the reduction of carbon emissions. And yes, that's really important, and it's something that we should be really careful about. But I think it's not the only thing that food growing in a community does, and that kind of trying to measure something in such a narrow way is we found really problematic. Not only does it sort of mask the shifting of responsibility of a government kind of agency passing on the responsibility of dealing with climate change to communities through food growing, it also doesn't take into consideration that not everyone is in a position to grow their own food. Not everyone has access to land or the resources of these things needed. And that actually, those are the challenges of rural communities quite often. And actually, maybe it's something more to do with how food is distributed. That is one of the key challenges. But we were really interested in actually sort of celebrating the other aspects that food growing can have in a community, the way that it can bring people together, that across generations, the way that it can be an opportunity for people to share knowledge, so all these kind of other things we found were as important as actually food growing for dealing with climate change. Sorry, that was a very long-winded answer, and I don't really know if I answered it, but yeah.
That's great. It makes that connection as well between ecos, doesn't it, within ecology and economy, which exactly. I was introduced to as a concept around breaking bread at the table at home with new friends. And if you think about that in terms of a friendship bond, based around food. What could be more important with the resource, a resource that needs to feed you and bring a community together there? And Stephen, in terms of just asking that question again to you, could you elaborate on the work that you're doing? Because in a way it exemplifies this, how crofting and food growing can deliver for communities and climate.
I think one of the things that Joss talked about in his story was economies of scale, and I would challenge that. Those economies, I would suggest, are false economies that are derived from exploitative, quite destructive practices that we're seeing in our everyday, and as a climate emergency deepens. So I think that there are, like Joss says, there are community values embedded within food production. I mean, it's the origins of culture, isn't it? Agriculture. And I'm reminded as you speak, Kevin, about that thing that George Monbiot always talks about, and the origins of the word companionship comes from companos, with bread. And I think there are so many positive externalities that arise from food, and they've been addressed in really creative approaches taken by during the consultation in the Glasgow City Council food consultation, where they kind of involved everyone. They involved from healthcare professionals to the criminal justice system to employment. It affects every avenue of our lives, and I think those values embedded in crofting, whether they're about working to shared aims, couldn't be more appropriate now in this era, or whether it's about, as a conversation moves from climate mitigation to adaptation, how do we respond to what's about to unfold? You know, how do we actually, what are our practical responses to those challenges? And I suppose it's about having mud on our boots. It's about actually doing it.
Oh, I'm feeling it in terms of absolutely speaking my language, and I hope that resonates with those of you who are listening today. I've got a further follow-up question around what have been some of the major successes in each of your projects. Again, if I go to Stephen this time, and Joss, you can follow it up.
So over 10 years ago, Mike Small was the founder of a group called the Fife Diet. I don't know if anyone is aware of that. It was very large. At the time, it was credited as being the largest food group of its type in Europe. There was a lot of participants. It was a big deal. It gained a lot of press attention. And Mike Small said at the end of that project, he started it saying, how do you eat local? How do we eat the food that's around us? And at the end of the project, he said, well, how do you make a sustainable food system in an unsustainable economy? Which I thought was pretty profound. And what I have found in my travels and trying to sell local food for local consumption is that it needs to break out of the worthy section. And how do you do that? Well, harnessing the economic drivers that exist and to some degree subverting them. Whether that's in DMO creation that the talk we're engaged in today is about, or whether it's in creative interventions. There are many of them. And so I think what's successful about what's came out of it is organising food production and working together for collective aims. But the challenges are huge. And yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, Kevin, but that's some of the thoughts I've got.
That's great. And I think in terms of that, thinking about the collective, it is about the community. If any of you have read Tim Ingold's, and you'll see the social anthropological thread that comes through him is that we should stop thinking in building blocks, because when you use that narrative, it limits you to think inside your own square box. But if we think in lines and how we're connected, each and every one of us can help each other. If we can only put our own interests to one side. And again, when I did community development, one of the things that challenged me was this concept that There were over 100 in 1958, under over 100 definitions of community. And yet the one thread that came through is community begins when people realize their own interests are better served by working with others. There's something to think, humility to think about there, isn't there? Joss, and so I'll direct the same question back to you in terms of what are the major successes of your project? Bringing arts in community and linking food and systems. Actually, I think you and Stephen should get together. There's something in there, isn't there? There's a story. There's a happy ending to this story I can see coming forward. But in terms of where are you now? Share your successes.
Yeah, these are difficult questions. Yeah, I'd just like to say I'm a fifer. So yeah, I think Mike Small's work has been a really big influence. I spent a lot of my childhood working on an organic farm that was sort of part of that kind of Fife diet. Yeah, what the successes? I think that's a really hard thing to. I mean, also in a way, I'm also sometimes more interested in the failures, right? That's quite often where you maybe learn the most. But I think I just sort of echoing what Stephen was saying. I think the sort of organizing aspect of it that came out of the project was one of the kind of most important things. I felt that what the project did was it created we took over an empty shop, and we created a kind of series, a number of resources that the community could access, and as well as this kind of swap shop where people could bring in produce that they had too much of and bring in other stuff in exchange for it. And I think actually maybe what I felt was actually just creating that space where people could come together and have these conversations, and that it became about kind of trying to develop some kind of collective kind of energy around dealing with what's a really complex and difficult problem, and knowing that, you know, it's through conversations with people and doing stuff together that problem kind of becomes maybe easier or more understandable, or and for us the really important thing was bringing joy and celebration into it. Like, you know, that the really important thing is like when you're like the weight of the climate and ecological emergency that's constantly saying, you know, you can't do this and you shouldn't do that, like unless we're then creating these stories, and maybe this is also related to George Monbiot and his, you know, he also talks really about the importance of stories, you know, and the importance of providing new ones, of creating new ones, that we're not just saying no to things, but also saying, yes, this is what we'd like to do, and this is a story that we want to tell. And so I think that was really important for us to bringing the kind of collective and community sense of joy and celebration that also goes along with food and food growing.
Yeah, there's a lot to be said for joy. I can remember reading the incoming narrative of the new CEO at the Rachel Carson Centre in München, who they write some amazing work, and he wrote a piece on slow hope. And this word hope and joy, if we look on the positives rather than narrative, I mean, I stopped listening to the radio and watching TV because the narrative was actually taking me in the wrong direction. And what I've done is diverted all that positive energy into things that I take forward. And it sounds like you two do too, because I can't believe you've got time to read the newspapers or watch TV. There's a question coming through, which is actually also really challenging, because it asks, how do we grow environmentally sustainable food in the winter? Does this require a lot of inputs in terms of fertilizers and energy to keep, and specific ones around plants, but you've also got animals. And I can remember from my first agricultural degree, it was all about the West Coast, the west of the UK grows really good grass, and grass is converted into animals. So, you know, there was a model there that had been sort of imposed as the agricultural doctrine, but bringing that up to date and thinking sustainably in terms of more closed systems. How do we do that? How do we grow food in the winter? Or maybe I'll widen that. If not grow, how do we preserve food so it's available in the winter? Joss, do you want to have a go at that one?
Yeah, I'll try to. I guess preserving is a really important thing. That was something that we spent a lot of time doing, was looking at different kind of methods of preservation, of preserving and fermenting. Lots of these like things that have happened for a long time, and that maybe would have been more commonplace, and just sort of like trying to think more seasonally as well. I think that's something that before this project I didn't really do so much, whereas actually what the project allowed was this sort of change and to become more seasonally. So we're always thinking ahead as well, thinking, okay, these are the things that are growing now, but these are the things that I might like to save for later on in the year, and how do we do that? So that kind of shift towards more seasonal thinking I found really important. I don't know so much about the kind of ecological impact of kind of growing through the winter, but I know I used to live in Helsinki in Finland, and they have a very sort of like very cold winter, which is quite often in the minuses for long periods of time. But they have a lot more of like heated polytunnels, so heated through kind of wood burning stove, stuff like that, and they managed to grow kind of throughout the seasons with these like heated polytunnels. It seems really successful. I don't know about the kind of wider impact of that. But.
Okay, and Stephen, your thoughts on that?
The question was, Kevin, how do we grow through the winter?
Yeah, and do that sustainably with, in terms of thinking about carbon, thinking about heat, thinking about fertilizers, especially with the cost going up by what, twice, double the price now they were only 6 months ago.
Yeah, I suppose we represent the survivors, the descendants of people who have came through, thousands of years of survival in the climate that we live in. And I think, yes, it's changing, but those techniques are still, valid. I mean, the winter time isn't a non-productive time of the year. The Hungry Gap occurs at another time of the year. That's in the early spring kind of time for horticultural there's a kind of drought of produce. It's not necessarily in the winter, if you know what I mean. And like Joss says, I've been to the Arctic Circle, Akureyri, where they're growing outdoors in non-heated environments. And the interesting thing is that with overwintering, which is a really traditional skill, you can store things in the ground. You don't need to harvest them. And so you might think that that's really difficult to kind of sustain yourself over winter. In fact, that's not the challenge. That's not in the cycle. That's not where the challenges necessarily lie. It's quite an abundant time for root vegetables and I suppose meat traditionally as well. And I think part of the question was in a sustainable way. Well, I think, again, to return to crofting, we've worked that out. We're pretty good at that, and those sustainable practices that are the heritage that we have around crofting are just that. They're indigenous. This indigenous agriculture, it has proven itself over thousands of years to be a really successful system. Which really interesting work by in the Blacklands project in South Uist kind of, I suppose, shows us that it's quite restorative. Actually, that small mosaic approach to agriculture is very restorative. There's an increased biodiversity when it's applied. So I hope that answers your question.
Absolutely, I think the right words are coming through there in terms of restorative. And you were absolutely right to say that the problem with food is not necessarily over winter, when you can store and preserve, but coming through in the spring. There's another element that I would like to bring in there, because it's interesting when you look around Westeros, most of the people live around the coast. And in terms of when I was up at MVU, one of the problems with that coastal influx of tourists was how we deal with the waste that's generated. And I put a proposal together for the water when they were looking at extending that sewage treatment plant, as why they didn't, like Ludwig said to Bazalgette when Robert Peel was looking to resolve the problem with the London sewers. Why don't you turn it into fertilizer, put it back on the land, and use the heat that's generated to grow food through the winter in terms of controlled environmental agriculture? And they thought I'd gone mad. Well, I mean, I place it here because I think you guys could actually see the merit in that, and rather than spending millions of pounds trying to not clean it up properly, but just get it enough through standards they can pump it out to the sea, which seems to be an absolute waste of all that resource that's being brought to you in that part of the world. Anyway, I'll park that one because Greg has put something up around plant-based and a question mark. Do we think there's opportunities? And Stephen, I sort of primed that in a way because I mentioned that traditionally we think of the West being the place of growing grass. You mentioned that indigenous agriculture, that shifting pattern of agriculture that used to go on as well, and that mosaic landscape. Is there a complementarity with this plant-based and that type of indigenous agriculture? Or is it something you think actually at a local level, we need a different local solution? Over to you.
I think the cutting edge of sustainable food production is where it meets with conservation. And it's my opinion in my travels that there's more in common than divides them, those two camps, whether it's rewilding or whether it's animal agriculture embedded in crofting methods. And I don't think that I think they actually complement each other. I know people who keep livestock purely for the rotation. Just to return to your waste issue there with Bazalgette and so on, I live off grid and I have a composting toilet, and people are always very interested to know just exactly what they're eating and where the chain was, which is exactly what was used in that chain. It didn't seem to bother people in the past. So, sorry, what was the question, Kevin?
Yeah, I think you're answering it anyway, because I asked, it was a question around plant-based. Is there a complementarity or a challenge in terms of that local food system?
Well, I've found in the group, working with the group, we naturally gravitated to working with the vegan cafe. Now, I have livestock, other people own livestock in the group, but as I say, there's more that in common with their interests than divides us. And whilst there might be a kind of ideological separation in that one area, there's so much more in common. I don't think it's necessary that we have. I know that some people are really keen on it, that animals exist within those systems. I'm not so sure. We're animals, and we have played that part in the past in some communities. And so I'm not entirely sure. It's a fluid one. And yeah.
No, I hear you. I mean, there's a link come through in terms of just asking, it's probably more directly at Stephen, but Joss, with your shop, maybe there's something in there as well. What type of foods do the collective produce, and do you add value to those products? And what's the distribution methods? Yeah, Stephen, do you want to focus on that one first? Then Joss, if you've got anything, you can add it.
A really incredible range, actually. Grapes, Lochaber grapes, who knew? I suppose polytunnels allow us to grow a much wider range, and that is something that's amazingly quite common for a short period in the year. But the staples are root vegetables, and those things that grow well. You can imagine potatoes, kale, the traditional ones, and meat. But they're outside of that, they're really incredible seasonal variations. The soft fruit that we have in the west of Scotland is the best in the world. It's incredible, and so quite a incredible array that just is truly seasonal. I mean, there's no alternative. Part of the rules of the group is it has to be made within the bounds of the region. So it has that proper sense of provenance around bioregionality, and it's that's locked in. A lot of local food groups have that 20-80 split where they have to make it economically viable, but we've kind of really locked ourselves to the highest principles. And whilst our members aren't organically certified, because that process is very expensive, they ascribe to organic principles, which often exceed those sort of, boundaries for soil association certification.
Brilliant. And Joss, can you add anything to that in terms of your own shop
Yeah, I mean, other than just, I'm really amazed hearing about Stephen and your work. I'm really in awe. Yeah, I guess maybe just kind of going back to like some of the points in the sort of previous question, and I think certainly my experience has been that there's not like one method, but what we need is a plurality of different ways of growing food and different systems that work within different particular ecosystems, and there's not a kind of catch-all for that. And I think it's really also important in these conversations, particularly, like when people are talking about rewilding and stuff like this, that it's also like it goes hand in hand with also maybe like repeopling. Like, I think people are an important part of this conversation as well, and yes, it's really important maybe that we like decenter ourselves in this process and are, aware of like the problems that human exceptionalism can cause. But I think we also can't dismiss ourselves in these conversations. And I think that there's a tendency for things like rewilding to sound like people from the south of Britain have this idea that Scotland can just be rewilded and that'll solve all our problems. And I think that's like a really, it's really not nice to hear that, I think that doesn't deal with the complexity of it. And so, yeah, we need to remember about the people. And I think we also have to learn to love shit. That's the other thing.
Yeah. No, Josh, I mean, a really nice thread again there. Those of you who don't know the work of James Hunter around repeopling, there's some brilliant talks we should direct you towards on YouTube, because that will blow your mind, and it will hopefully blow any biases that you might have inherited through that rewilding concept. And I was early doors in that rewilding at Windsor, and I remember bringing over Franz Vera, who was blowing our minds as ecologists at that time, thinking about where the mega herbivores were and where the predator species. But my time in Wester Ross really brought home, this is a landscape of people and wildlife. It always was. It always should be, but somehow we lose that in the narratives come through. So thank you for bringing that forward. There's a question here about how you measure carbon reduction in terms of the emissions related to food growing. Is there anyone who wants to volunteer that one?
I can talk specifically about the Climate Challenge Fund, because that was how we were supposed to measure the project. And I totally understand, that funders need some kind of metrics and able to do that. But with our project, it was really a bit flawed, because we had to get people to weigh the amount of food that they'd produced through our project, and then the Climate Challenge Fund had an Excel sheet that we could put this in, and it calculated the amount of emissions that they would have saved through having grown this food rather than having bought it from the supermarket, let's say. But there's a sort of obvious problem in that. If one person grows tatties for the year, and we measure that tatties weigh a lot. It looks like they've saved a lot of carbon emissions. But compare that to someone who might have grown different salads and different herbs and different things. It looks like they've, things that are maybe less weighty. And so the metrics would say that the person that's grown the potatoes has kind of done better. But actually the person who's grown the salad and the different herbs might have actually come to a better understanding of their kind of place within an ecology. And so, but the metrics just wouldn't show that. So that's how our project was. That's how we had to measure.
No, Josh, that helps. So there's a question here for both of you to sort of feed into from Nick. It's quite a nice challenge, actually. There's a retail business unit in the centre of the village near me that has been empty for years. What suggestions do the speakers, or indeed the participants who could type in in the chat here have for us if we want to turn this into a community cafe stroke kitchen? What would be our first steps?
I think your first step would be to establish what success looks like. What is it you're hoping to achieve? And then build from there. I think that quite often the design by committee method can sometimes, whilst can be really creative and emergent things can come about from it, often, actually, that's my experience, it can also lead to quite confusing directions, tangents. So you have to establish just that, what success looks like, and have a time period.
Okay, I mean, again, that's a fantastic answer. What I want to do is give the presenters a bit of time to actually sum up their thoughts on what they've heard from each other, what they've presented, but also the questions they've been asked. At the same time, Josh and Stephen, there's so many questions come through and I really haven't got time to answer them, stick to a schedule, but could you go in afterwards and try to attempt to type something in and answer some of the bottom? There's 8 new questions just come through as I've been saying this, but just it would help because there's obviously a lot of interest here. But Josh, if I turn to you first of all and just ask you to reflect on what you've heard, think about what you've said as well, and those questions have come through, to give a closing comment.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, just thank you. It's been really great to be in this conversation, and maybe just as a sort of closing comment, I'm really interested in the work of J.K. Gibson Graham, is the pen name of 2 feminist economic geographers from Australia, and they sort of identify that one of the sort of key challenges that we face is this sort of separation between ecology and economy, and how the economy is seen as this thing which a kind of that is a kind of distinct sphere of kind of activity separate from all the other things like the social, the political, the ecological, and that maybe the sort of key challenge is actually finding a way to make the economic more ecological, and to recognize, like you said earlier, Kevin, you know, the link, the close etymological link between the two. And so for me, that's what I'm really interested in, is how we can rethink and reenact the relationship between economy and ecology, and through food and food growing. And I think in that it's really about perhaps replacing the ecology with the economy with something which is more about the kind of restorative and biodiverse ecologies that are so important. So that was not such a good way of summing things up, but that's perhaps a final.
No, that's wonderful. I was going to ask Stephen, but he just disappeared off screen. So Stephen, if you can hear me, would you come back and give your closing thoughts? Thank you.
Sorry, Kim, my battery, as I say, I live off grid and I've just noticed my battery. So the question was closing thoughts, I suppose, and what I'm interested in. I think I don't want to, I'm very keen not to appear as an ideologue, and I'm interested in the doing, the actual creative doing, and working with people. I think food could scarcely be higher in the hierarchy of importance right now. It's pivotal to so much else, whether it's in a rural context or an urban one. We're facing incredible challenges from, a confluence of things right now we can see in the horizon and in the near horizon, in the near future. So it's about creating a new system. I think the second hearing of the Good Food Nation Bill was going through Parliament this week on Tuesday, I think. And there's a call for a right to food to kind of embed SDG 2 in legislation in Scotland. And, SDG 17, partnership working. I think it's about working together to create these partnerships, but importantly, retaining that bioregionality that I think that you're doing in Wester Ross, recognising the unique conditions for your area. So the bigger picture is, working in policy and creating these new systems, short supply chains, sustainable methods, but also on a local level. So we can have these Highland-wide initiatives, but they're not necessarily translatable to your everyday regions of, Highland's enormous, as you know, famously bigger than Belgium, as everyone likes to tell you. Yeah, that's my thoughts. Working with people to create solutions on the ground.
Stephen and Joss, I've just had one of the most fascinating sessions, and so grateful that you could share your thoughts with us today, and also thank those of you that have engaged. The questions coming through were just absolutely on point, and they allowed for a wonderful discussion, which I could just carry on all day. Unfortunately, we've got to come to an end because thinking about food and thinking about Stephen's battery, we're going to take a break now, and we're going to come back at 12:45, where we're going to look at developing community-led climate solutions for Wester Ross. I hope your appetite has been formed, but you can come back with enough fuel in the tank to engage with us in a similar way. And please, in the interim, raise your hands, flash your gadgets, whatever you need to do, and thank Joss and Stephen for a great session. It's wonderful. Thank you.